The story begins not in whispers of murder, but in the soot-filled air of a Victorian mining town. Mary Ann Robson was born in 1832 in a small village in County Durham. To outsiders, her beginnings seemed ordinary, one of many children born into a working-class family during Britain's industrial rise. Yet within those cobbled streets and dimly lit cottages, the seeds of something darker were quietly taking root. Her father, a coal miner, worked long, brutal hours underground, and the family lived in the shadow of poverty. Life was fragile. Death was always near, whether from mine accidents, disease, or famine. In such an environment, people grew hardened. But in Mary Ann, there seemed to be something else, a quiet detachment, an ambition that whispered of wanting more than just survival. As a child, she was described as intelligent, well-mannered, even attractive in her dark-eyed way. Teachers and neighbors recalled her politeness, though some noted an unnerving coldness beneath her charm. She smiled often, but rarely did her eyes match the warmth of her lips. This young girl, growing in the midst of hardship, would one day leave a trail of tragedy that made her infamous as Britain's first known serial poisoner. But in these early years, no one could have predicted the horrors that were to come. Yet fate was already at work. When Mary Ann was still young, tragedy struck, the death of her father in a mining accident. The loss plunged the family further into hardship, and perhaps, for Mary Ann, ignited the belief that death could change fortunes. Her childhood was marked by instability and grief, and as she stepped into adulthood, her life seemed destined for the ordinary struggles of a Victorian working-class woman. But Mary Ann was never ordinary. She would learn that in a world where poverty ruled, poison could be both weapon and solution. And soon, she would use it. The first victim of Mary Ann Cotton's cold ambition would not be a stranger, but someone within her own home. By the age of 20, Mary Ann married her first husband, William Mowbray, a colliery worker. Like many young women of her time, she sought stability, a home, and children to carry on their name. But what she found instead was struggle. The couple moved frequently, from Durham to Cornwall, chasing work opportunities. Mary Ann bore children. Some accounts say as many as 4 or 5, but many did not survive infancy. Disease was rampant in Victorian England, and child mortality was heartbreakingly common. Yet in Mary Ann's story, death seemed to linger unusually close. Neighbors noted the frequent funerals, the drawn face of William, and the quiet but composed demeanor of Mary Ann. Where others wept, she stood tall. Where grief should have broken her, she appeared oddly collected. Then, William himself fell ill. His stomach pains worsened over days, his body weakening, his skin paling. Doctors suspected gastric fever, a common enough ailment at the time. But after William's death, whispers began. How was it that misfortune seemed to stalk Mary Ann's home so relentlessly? She moved on quickly, dressed in black but carrying herself with unsettling poise. And soon after, something curious happened. Mary Ann collected on William's life insurance, a modest sum, but enough to ease her burdens. This would not be the last time tragedy and financial relief would come hand in hand. For Mary Ann Cotton, death had become a companion, a tool, and perhaps a temptation. One husband gone, several children buried, and a widow at just 26, Mary Ann was only getting started. Her second marriage would bring not just scandal, but a more chilling pattern. Mary Ann didn't waste time. In Victorian society, widows often remarried quickly out of necessity, and she was no exception. She married George Ward, an engineer, a man respected in his trade. But even before the vows had settled, George fell gravely ill. His illness, too, baffled doctors. He wasted away slowly, his stomach racked with pain, his vitality drained. Once again, Mary Ann was the grieving widow, clad in mourning black, standing by as yet another coffin was lowered into the earth. Neighbors shook their heads, pitying her misfortune. Some muttered about a curse that seemed to follow her. But others began to look closer. Why did death always visit Mary Ann's doorstep? Why did she never appear broken by loss? When George's insurance money came into her possession, the whispers grew louder. Still, in a world where women were expected to endure, few openly accused her. Mary Ann's charm was her greatest weapon. She was kind, attentive, and carried an aura of tragic beauty that drew sympathy and suitors alike. Behind closed doors, however, she had learned something vital. Arsenic, easily obtainable in the Victorian household, was both invisible and deadly. And with each burial, she grew bolder. 2 husbands gone, insurance collected, neighbors unsettled. And yet, Mary Ann wasn't slowing down. In fact, she was about to escalate, and even her own children would not be safe. Children, in Marianne's life, were not only born frequently, they also died frequently. Some neighbors chalked it up to bad luck, others to the cruel hand of fate. But those who looked closely began to see something far more sinister. Of Marianne's reported 13 children, the majority did not live to adulthood. Again and again, doctors wrote gastric fever or natural causes on the death certificates. But behind the quiet doors of Marianne's homes, arsenic was doing its silent work. Imagine the suspicion: tiny coffins lowered into the ground, one after another. Neighbors began to whisper. Even in an age where death was common, Marianne's household seemed cursed beyond belief. But Marianne remained composed, her grief measured, her face unshaken. And each time, she collected insurance or received parish relief. Death, it seemed, was becoming her livelihood. When the death toll grew too high to ignore, the whispers around town turned into accusations. But Marianne was always one step ahead, and her next marriage would bring her closer than ever to exposure. By now, Marianne's reputation was complicated. To some, she was a tragic widow cursed by fate. To others, she was a woman shadowed by unnatural loss. But still, men were drawn to her. She married James Robinson, a widower with several children. At first, the union seemed practical. He needed a wife, she needed stability. But soon, tragedy returned. Robinson's children, one by one, fell sick. Their symptoms mirrored those of Marianne's earlier victims: stomach pains, vomiting, wasting away. Robinson himself grew suspicious. He noticed Marianne's strange calmness amid tragedy, her eagerness to suggest arsenic for household chores, and her pressing interest in life insurance. Then, one day, she asked a question that chilled him. She inquired about insuring his life. For Robinson, it was the final straw. He threw her out of the house, fearing for his own safety. This was the first time Marianne's pattern nearly cost her freedom. But she was resourceful, and she was far from finished. Cast out, with her reputation darkening, Marianne could have faded into obscurity. But instead, she remarried, and her next victim would finally bring the suspicions to a deadly climax. Marianne's final marriage was to Frederick Cotton, a miner. With him came a ready-made family, children from his previous marriage. Marianne, once again, stepped into the role of wife and mother. But death followed swiftly. Frederick fell ill, his stomach twisting in agony, his body wasting away. Soon after, 2 of his children died under eerily similar circumstances. Once again, Marianne was left in mourning clothes. Yet this time, something was different. Her confidence had grown, but so had suspicion. Neighbors openly gossiped. Doctors, too, began questioning the repeated gastric fevers in her home. Still, Marianne pressed on, even beginning an affair with a lodger in the Cotton household. She spoke casually of the deaths, even suggesting that children were more trouble than they were worth. Her words would come back to haunt her. When one of Frederick's surviving sons fell sick, the doctor refused to accept the easy explanation of gastric fever. He took a closer look, and what he found cracked Marianne's deadly facade wide open. Dr. Kilburn, who had been treating the Cotton children, was uneasy. Their symptoms were too consistent, too deliberate. When young Charles Edward Cotton fell ill, Kilburn decided to dig deeper. Marianne, meanwhile, grew impatient. She openly spoke about Charles being a burden and even remarked, chillingly, "He'll go like the rest." These words spread quickly among neighbors. Alarmed, Kilburn demanded an investigation. And for the first time, Marianne faced the scrutiny she had long escaped. Charles died soon after, but Kilburn insisted on a post-mortem. The results revealed what many had long suspected. Arsenic, the silent killer of the Victorian age, was present in the child's body. The evidence was undeniable. Marianne was arrested, but could she charm her way out once again? Or had her deadly pattern finally caught up with her? In 1873, Marianne Cotton stood trial for the murder of her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. The courtroom buzzed with curiosity and horror. Here was a woman, dressed in black, calm and composed, accused of unspeakable crimes. Witnesses testified to her chilling remarks, her suspicious eagerness around insurance policies, and the consistent pattern of deaths surrounding her. Doctors detailed the presence of arsenic, the unmistakable hand of poison. Marianne denied it all, her defense painting her as a victim of circumstance. But the weight of evidence was crushing. The jury deliberated briefly before declaring her guilty. The verdict sealed her fate, but would the execution of Britain's first female serial poisoner bring justice, or only more questions about how many truly died at her hands? On March 24, 1873, Crowds gathered outside Durham prison. The gallows stood ready. Marion Cotton, Britain's first known serial poisoner, was led out to meet her fate. Dressed in black, she walked with composure, her face calm, her lips pursed. Witnesses noted her chilling lack of emotion, even as the noose was placed around her neck. At precisely 10 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Marion Cotton was no more. But her death brought little closure. For though she was convicted of one murder, suspicions swirled that she was responsible for at least 21 deaths, husbands, lovers, stepchildren, and even her own flesh and blood. The execution was the end of Mary Ann, but not the end of her story. The legend of Britain's first female serial poisoner would echo for generations, raising one haunting question: how many more had she really killed? Marion Cotton's crimes shook Victorian Britain. She exposed a terrifying truth: that poison, so common in every household, could be a silent weapon in the hands of someone ruthless enough to use it. Her case changed the way people viewed life insurance, domestic safety, and even the role of women in crime. Newspapers branded her a monster, a black widow who wove death into every relationship. But beyond the sensational headlines lies something more chilling. Marion Cotton was not just a murderer. She was a mother, a wife, a neighbor. Her evil wore the mask of normalcy, making it all the more terrifying. And today, her name remains etched in history as a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a smile. The execution may have silenced her, but questions linger. What about the victims who never received justice? What about the psychology that drove her? And why, even now, does her shadow linger in the corridors of true crime history? Marion Cotton's story is more than a string of deaths. To truly understand her, we must look behind the black veil she wore, both literally and figuratively. To neighbors and acquaintances, Marion seemed ordinary, even likable. She carried herself with poise, dressed neatly, and could charm with a smile. She was intelligent and articulate, far from the stereotype of the brutish criminal. But those who knew her closely saw flashes of something colder. She spoke of her children with detachment, often describing them as burdens rather than blessings. She joked, at times cruelly, about her husband's ailments. It was this ability to wear two faces, compassionate widow in public, cold manipulator in private, that allowed her to operate undetected for so long. Her charm was not just a mask, it was her deadliest weapon. Yet the most unsettling part was not her ability to kill, but her ability to carry on as though nothing had happened. To cook meals, to attend church, to chat with neighbors, all while quietly plotting death. The smiling widow who waved politely at her neighbors was the same woman who mixed arsenic into a cup of tea. A disturbing duality defined her, and it's what makes her story so haunting even today. But how exactly did she manage to escape suspicion for over a decade, while bodies piled up around her? In Victorian England, Marian's crimes found fertile ground. Society itself became her greatest accomplice. Arsenic was everywhere, sold in apothecaries, used in dyes, even kept in households for cleaning. Its effects, vomiting, diarrhea, severe stomach pain, closely mimicked common illnesses of the time like cholera or gastric fever. To most doctors, her victims appeared to be dying of natural causes. On top of that, life insurance had become increasingly common in the 19th century. Policies were affordable even for working-class families, and payouts were often enough to cover debts or provide a fresh start. For Marianne, they became a motive and a shield. After each death, she would collect her claim and move to a new town, blending into a fresh community where no one knew her past. She also benefited from the era's perception of women. Victorian England held tightly to the belief that women were nurturing by nature, incapable of such calculated cruelty. A widow, surrounded by tragedy, inspired pity, not suspicion. These factors formed the perfect cover. Poison was quiet, deaths were common, insurance provided financial reward, and society itself refused to believe a woman could be a predator. It was this cultural blindness that allowed Marianne to thrive. But even the most carefully woven lies eventually unravel. And when they did, the number of suspected victims shocked even hardened investigators. When Marion Cotton was finally exposed, investigators tried to piece together her past. The numbers they uncovered were staggering. She had married 4 times. 3 of her husbands were dead under suspicious circumstances. She bore around 13 children, of whom at least 10 died young, many with symptoms eerily similar to those of her husbands. She lived with lovers and partners, several of whom also died. The official record convicted her of a single murder, her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. But historians and criminologists estimate she may have killed at least 21 people. Some argue the true number could be higher, hidden in the shadows of history, masked by poor medical records and the frequency of death in Victorian households. The list of suspected victims reads like a ledger of tragedy: husbands, children, stepchildren, lovers, even her own mother. Nearly everyone who lived with Mary and faced the same fate. The scale of her suspected crimes makes her not just a serial killer, but one of the most prolific in British history. And yet, in her time, the legal system could only prove one. This gap between suspicion and conviction remains one of the most chilling aspects of her case. If she was capable of killing so many, what does that say about the world she lived in, and about the darkness she carried within her? What drove Marion Cotton? Was it greed, survival, or something deeper and darker? Psychologists today speculate that several forces may have shaped her. The loss of her father at a young age may have taught her that death could bring change, sometimes even financial stability. As an adult, she may have turned this lesson into a weapon, seeing arsenic as a means of control. Greed undoubtedly played a role. Each death was followed by financial relief, either through life insurance payouts or parish support. In an age where women had little independence, poisoning offered her both money and freedom. But greed alone cannot explain the scale of her killings. Many victims, including children, brought her no profit at all. This points to something colder: a psychological detachment from human life, perhaps even a hidden resentment toward those closest to her. Poisoners, unlike violent killers, thrive on patience and subtlety. Their weapon is invisibility. For Marianne, the slow, methodical nature of poisoning may have offered a sense of control, of power over life and death. Her case reveals a mind both practical and chillingly detached, a woman who blended into society while quietly bending it to her will. But even after her execution, her story refused to die. Instead, it left ripples that changed both law and culture in Britain forever. The trial and execution of Marion Cotton sent shockwaves through Victorian Britain. Newspapers carried her story across the nation, branding her as a black widow and a modern media. But beyond the sensationalism, her crimes forced the authorities to confront serious flaws in the system. First, coroners and doctors became more cautious in labeling deaths as natural causes. The availability of arsenic made it clear that more rigorous testing was needed. Gradually, laws tightened around the sale of poison, requiring registers of purchases and stricter controls. Second, the insurance system came under scrutiny. While life insurance was meant to support families in times of hardship, Marion had turned it into a deadly incentive. Her case exposed how easily it could be abused, leading to calls for stricter regulations. Finally, her trial challenged Victorian gender norms. If a woman could commit such calculated crimes, then the stereotype of female innocence was no longer unshakable. The idea of the female criminal entered public consciousness in a way it never had before. In this way, Marion Cotton's legacy went beyond fear. She changed the way Britain handled both crime and domestic life. Yet despite reforms, the fascination with her story only grew. And it wasn't just the public who became obsessed. Writers, criminologists, and even folklorists carried her name into legend. Even after her death, Marion Cotton lived on, not in flesh, but in whispers. In the north of England, her name became part of local folklore. Children taunted one another with playground rhymes about her, verses that warned of the woman who poisoned them all. Songs and ballads carried her name, blurring the line between history and myth. Her story was told around firesides and in taverns, not just as a tale of crime, but as a cautionary legend about greed and betrayal. She became a figure both feared and morbidly fascinating, her image etched into the collective memory of Victorian Britain. In later decades, her case was studied by criminologists as one of the earliest examples of systematic female serial killing. Plays, novels, and television dramas would later reimagine her life, each interpretation exploring the enigma of the smiling widow who buried so many loved ones. The folklore painted her as something more than human, an embodiment of danger, a reminder that evil can wear the most familiar face. But behind the legend was a very real question. How could so many lives be lost, and so few noticed until it was far too late? Though Marion Cotton was convicted for the death of her stepson, most of her suspected victims never received justice. William Mowbray, her first husband, was laid to rest without suspicion. George Ward, her second husband, passed with doctors convinced he suffered from gastric illness. Frederick Cotton, her last husband, was buried before a full investigation could be launched. And then there were the children, tiny lives lost, often written off as victims of the era's high child mortality rate. For many of them, No investigation was ever done. Their names faded into parish records, marked only as died young. This absence of justice is what makes the case so haunting. We will never know the exact number of victims, nor will we ever fully grasp the extent of the suffering within her homes. Their silence, however, speaks volumes. The victims without justice remind us of the hidden tragedies of history, the stories erased by time, and the fragility of truth when evil wears a convincing mask. It is for their sake that Marianne's story continues to be told, not just as a tale of crime, but as a memorial for lives cut short. Why does the story of Marianne Cotton remain so chilling, even more than a century later? Part of the answer lies in the weapon she chose. Poison is slow, invisible, and intimate. Unlike a violent attack, it requires time and closeness. The victim shares meals, drinks tea, and confides in the very person who is slowly ending their life. It is betrayal in its purest form. Marianne Cotton reminds us that evil is not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it lives within the home, wears a kind smile, and calls itself family.